Hi guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. So we hear a lot of stuff about refugees and their plight all over the news today. The Rohingyas fleeing from Myanmar, the Palestinians trapped in the desert near Jerusalem, the Syrian refugees fleeing the civil war. Anyone who's reasonably well acquainted with the news would have heard of this term by now, and they might even have a rough idea on who and what a refugee is. But we need to remember that it's a highly technical legal term, and the more we understand the term, the more we can learn about how the entire process works. Because I've seen people who claim to be experts in this area often get mixed up in their own terminology. They sometimes get the term mixed up with immigration, particularly illegal immigration, even though that's a very, very different thing. So the law that oversees refugee protection, the document signed by most countries in the world to lay down the rules with regard to who a refugee is and how a refugee should be treated. This document is called the Convention Relating to the Status of Refugees, more commonly referred to as the Refugee Convention. This was approved by the UN in 1951 and came into force in 1954. So it's been about 70 years now since it came into force. This is the document which shapes our modern understanding of the word refugee. Out of the 200 or so countries in the world today, nearly 150 have ratified this convention. So we can say that it's a pretty globally accepted thing. So let's look at what this convention tells us and possibly critique it as well. The convention lists down a number of things that need to be true before someone can be recognized as a refugee. So you can't just turn up at a country that you like and demand that you be granted refugee status and taken in. You have to fall under the definition of a refugee before you can be given such protection. So firstly, the convention says you have to be fleeing your home country because of persecution. And this is a big difference between a refugee and a migrant. A migrant usually tends to be someone coming to a new country in order to seek a better way of life. Migrants are usually not fleeing anything other than a sense of dissatisfaction with the economic situation in their home countries. Refugees, on the other hand, need to be fleeing persecution. Persecution as in being treated in a hostile way, a bad way, by the state and its population. The convention also lists down the types of persecution that you need to be fleeing from for you to be a refugee. You can be running away from persecution on grounds of race, religion, nationality, ethnicity, social group, and political opinions. So if you're being persecuted in your country for any of these 6 things and you flee it, you are eligible to be sort of recognized as a refugee. You would qualify under that definition. So if you look at the recent controversy over immigration in the USA, for instance, particularly on the Mexican debate, that is clearly migration, maybe even illegal migration. Those are not people fleeing a civil war or a brutal dictatorship or a genocide or whatever. They are simply people seeking a better life. They are not stateless. And while they should be helped, they are not really refugees under the legal definition. A refugee is usually someone who is stateless as well. The Palestinians don't have their own state. The Rohingyas don't have their own state. Europe had millions of Jewish refugees in the aftermath of World War II, after the Holocaust. Or conversely, people who've been targeted by their home countries deliberately, they would also qualify as refugees who need to run away. The Kurdish population under Saddam Hussein, the population which Saddam supposedly used chemical weapons against, is one example. The Uyghurs of China, who are currently undergoing all kinds of horrors, that's another example. So you should either be lacking a state, or it should be quite clear that the state you officially belong to is systematically persecuting you in some way. Let me tell you what some of the fundamental debates in this area are. The most prominent one is whether countries have a duty, a responsibility to take in refugees. The Refugee Convention says yes, You have a duty to do so. You have to take in refugees. But in recent years, countries have started to push back on this obligation. Even the Western nations, which initially created this requirement. I know most of you will remember the huge debate over Syrian refugees wanting to get to Europe a few years ago, and many European nations resisting the EU's attempts to take in large numbers of refugees. They were like, listen, there are a dozen countries between Western Europe and Syria. Why do all of them need to come here? And why are we being spoken to like we are the racists? Why can't all these Middle Eastern countries, or West Asian countries, as I would say, why can't they take all these people in? Why should it be our responsibility? So the issue of whether any and all refugees should be accepted is itself a major debate today. Another debate is whether the refugees themselves have duties they need to abide by. Russia, for instance, has very clearly said, look, if you want to come here and live here, you need to do so by our own rules and customs. And you're welcome if you do. But if you're going to come here and then make us regret our generosity by trying to impose your culture on us, then you're not going to be allowed here. Of course, countries like the UK and France can't afford to say that as explicitly as Putin did, although I guess they recently have said precisely that in their own way. Both the UK and the French heads of state have been embroiled in controversy over the remarks that they've made in just the last couple of months. And the final point of contention we often see is the issue of return. The Refugee Convention clearly says that if the facts which led you to leave your country in the first place, if those factors are no longer present, then you can no longer be a refugee. You need to go back to your home country, right? So if I flee from where I am to Canada, fleeing, let's say, an armed conflict, if that armed conflict is over, then I can no longer sit in Canada calling myself a refugee. But that isn't really practiced in the real world at all. If you're recognized as a refugee today, you're pretty much there forever, and your descendants are pretty much there forever as well. You're not going to be sending second generation and third generation Cambodians away simply because the Khmer Rouge no longer exists and Pol Pot is dead. That's just not going to happen. So what was always meant on paper to be a temporary act of kindness has now turned into a permanent demographic commitment, where if you agree to take in a certain community, even if they're fleeing from persecution, you're essentially agreeing to change the long-term demographics of your own society, which was never the initial intention of creating the concept of refugee protection. It was always meant as something where we take in people running away from a problem and they return once that problem is solved. So tell me what you guys think on some of these issues and on the larger point of refugee protection itself. As always, if you like content like this, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you, take care, and I'll see you soon.